Welcome to Meet the Storytellers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Karen Wickre. Karen's in San Francisco. Hi, Karen.
Ian, how are you?
I'm really good, thank you. It's lovely to have you on. We know each other. We've spent time in real life. We first met back on Twitter when you were at Twitter. So I'm not sure exactly when that was. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. So here we are in 2020. Karen, how do you describe yourself professionally?
I most often have a little. I think my business card and my website say something like connector, convener, or connector, communicator, and curator, something like that. And connector, that is a lifelong avocation. That is just who I am, and we can talk more about that. The communications part, communicator, is I have worked in uh, both corporate communications for a long time and also been a writer and editor, which is, of course, also communicating. Um, and curator, I'm just someone who finds interesting things all the time, and I feel like my job isn't done till I can pass it on to somebody else. So that's what that is about.
Nice. So tell us the backstory. Like, how did you end up as a professional communicator?
It really was about writing and editing. So I've been a writer for a long time, and I mean, in reality, I think I've been an editor for a long time, even from my college days and my first jobs out of school. I remember I was working at a little consulting firm, and one of the bosses said to somebody, "Have Karen look at that letter before it goes out." And I guess I had evidently done that before, and I improved it. And I knew how to sort of make things better, which is what I think an editor does. So uh, I always want to plug the editorial part of things because that is an important skill, regardless of what your title is, I think, and what you do. But understanding the value of taking raw material, disparate material, other people's material, and pulling it together. And by the way, it doesn't just have to be words, obviously. Um, so that's the sort of underpinning. And I've lived in San Francisco for 30 years. I fell quite by accident into the world of the early high tech, which was about personal computing, and there was a whole big wave of the early machines, and then a million magazines about all of them and all that, and trade shows and all that. I fell into that quite by accident, and there again, I think my writing and editing skills helped. Uh, it wasn't the only thing I was doing. I wasn't sitting writing 8 hours a day, but I was involved in that world. And that eventually led to me being part of a corporate communications team at Google in the early days. I went there as a contractor in 2002. And so I'd been on the journalism side. I'd been an editor of magazines. I'd been a writer for magazines, trade magazines. And so I was familiar with what PR people do, what they're supposed to do, how they work with journalists, all that. So that was a natural home for me. But from the beginning, I knew I'd have a different job. I was not going to be a PR person. I was not going to pitch, but I was going to work with those people and be an editor of their stuff, be an editor of company stuff, and that's really where it started. So I had about 15 years in corporate communications for both Google and Twitter.
So that role at Twitter as editorial director, just unpack that for us a bit, Karen, in terms of, you know, I get what that is, but for everyone on this watching, what does that actually entail?
Well, so this started, I would say, I have to say, I think Google was an early player in the idea that a company would have its own blog. And the blog would be the sort of repository of company statements, stories about products and so on, announcements, occasionally apologies, that happens. Google was pretty early in that, and I was lucky to be there when that was becoming a thing. And it could become a thing because Google was already a famous company and people watched it. So uh, putting that aside, meanwhile, over the years then, over the mid 2000s, let's say, other companies, especially tech companies first, started getting into this idea of having a company blog. Um, and I used to speak at all these blog conferences, and people would say, there's legal, fears, and we can't, they didn't have a clear idea of how this is essentially a publishing platform for a company. It didn't have to be a free for all for all the employees. That's not what it was about. Anyway, by the time I got to Twitter, this is a well-established practice. And so editorial director means many things at different places, but the idea here is I was on the communications team, which is where all the company news and information emanated from one way or the other through reporters that the PR people worked with, or sometimes simultaneously or sometimes not around reported news, company news and information. So I was the editor of the blog, and for a time, Twitter's own social account, which was a very tricky thing to do, I have to say. It's hard to be the one managing the account that's supposed to be the sort of show, the flagship of the product that you're also working on. But anyway, the idea there was to field have an editorial calendar, field, what are the announcements coming up? What is it we want to say about this, that, or the other thing? By the way, typically big companies have more than one blog. They have different countries, and they have they want to have a presence in different places in their own language. So it's overseeing that workflow and that process. It's not writing everything, and it's not always editing everything, although I tried. I put together style guide. I was the sort of either the bad cop, sometimes I'd get called in for that, and working with the PR team always on timing for what goes out when. So that by the time I was at Twitter, this is now kind of standard practice for all kinds of companies.
Yeah, we said just before we hit record, didn't we, that storytelling is such a buzzword now in business, and I wonder with you whether you were very much a corporate storyteller, Karen, before we called it storytelling. So I'm just curious about what your relationship is with storytelling, and how, just maybe looking back at some of those experiences at Google and Twitter, and looking over the blog and everything else. How do you see that fitting in with the corporate storytelling?
So I view myself as an editorial person, and to me, this is a distinction with the PR people, and I have all respect for good PR people who need to be and are often very strategic about what they're announcing and who says it and all that stuff. Their constituency is reporters. I viewed mine as really more the broader public. In a way, you might say a blog is like a magazine or a newspaper, although those are both terribly outdated now. But in any case, I had a broader view. A communications team at a company has the broadest view across a company, in my view, because between all the people in that team, they really know what's going on, even if it's not announced, even if there's things going behind the scenes, which there always are. I viewed my role as to weave something together between the product announcements. We always knew, for example, at Google in the early days, there were product announcements as a matter of course, but there was also a general agreement that's not all we want to do, right? You want this repository of content, of stories, to reflect the company as a whole. So that's not just a product announcement. It's also, it can be philanthropic initiatives, community affairs, highlighting teams, the people behind the products, stories about how people using the product are using it in distinctive, unusual ways, and things like that. And then, as I say, occasionally apologies, and also occasionally position statements, essentially. So if you look at the aggregate of this stuff, this reflects the company. and I have to say, well suited to this because uh, I had a wide, new things were coming to me all the time from different teams that we want to talk about, or what's an idea that we can talk about. I mean, well, I would also be looking for stories that were um, uh, friendly and safe or interesting, things I knew were not proprietary, to sort of essentially keep the editorial calendar going, right? And I would say, okay, it's Christmas season. We're going to be a little light. We need, a couple of things for this week and a couple of things for next week, and then I'll do my year-end wrap up. And I viewed myself in a way as a managing editor, and so that's and I think again I was well suited because I understood at the time. I understood the Google culture. I knew a lot of people around the company. I knew what made the essence of what was called googly at the time, and so it was I was well suited to draw these things out and put them together in a way. And that I don't even think, well, the whole time I was there, I left in 2011, I don't think we called it storytelling all that much. The marketing team, which was a separate team, was also doing its version of storytelling, right, in a very different way.
Mm.
I'd say on the communication side, the various channels that you have are a fascinating chronological window over time to see kind of the evolution of a company. In fact, if you look back at the very beginning of the Google blog, uh, we had gotten the clearance from the legal team to start it, but they agreed to it, I think, not understanding. Well, they agreed to it in principle, and then the IPO was announced. So then in that quiet period, there's really not that much. You can have business as usual posts about products that are coming out, but other than that, if you look back at the beginning, I think one of the first posts was a recipe from the cafe, because it had to be very, very safe. No, no questions asked. But after a while, it picked up steam. But anyway, I think that, to me, that is a kind of corporate storytelling. And
Sure.
also, I should say, it's not just happy news, and it's not
Mm.
just, here's how we prefer to be seen. Uh, Broadly speaking, I suppose you could say it is, but it's not. I view when you're posting about a complicated issue, that is also, that's an important part of the story. There was one time I was on the phone with Sergey Brin at midnight when we posted about um, the hack from China in early 2010, for example. And that's a fascinating part of the Google story. And to have Sergey's statement be the statement that was out at the time um, is to me a moment in history now, but also a fascinating story in and of itself.
Sure. And I mean, going with your kind of magazine analogy, I guess from an audience point of view, the audience want a diversity. I mean, that all those broad audiences want a diversity of stories and content, don't they? So there might be some nice human stories, lifting the lid on some of the people in the organization, even the recipe from the kitchen or whatever. And I guess that makes for perhaps more kind of audience friendly content. Having a, just in a magazine, you'd have your the opinion stuff, you'd have things about leisure and cooking, and maybe that works
Yep.
as a strategy, editorial strategy.
I think so. I should say the other thing is Google early on, even before I was there. I mean, they'd not issued that many press releases, and as you may recall, press releases were a very formulaic, a kind of statement or announcement that you'd put out to a company that would distribute it to wire services, who would then publish it in various places. Even in those early days, let's say around 2000, 2001, Google was not a press release happy company. I think they'd had one or two. And so the idea of having a blog appealed to the company because it was much more, it can be in our voice, and different people can be the named authors of pieces, and some of them did write their own pieces, and I was a very light edit. Some others I did a little more, but it was all individual voices from around the company. It wasn't not just executives. And so this idea that you can supplant the press release, which over time maybe is an amusing, sort of artifact of an old time, but it's not nearly the storytelling vehicle that one's own kind of blog or blogs could be.
Sure. So you made a good point about having to communicate, difficult stuff and bad news, and we are at a time, end of May 2020, obviously, when organizations are going through difficult times, having to lay staff off and furlough staff. And I'm sure like me, you saw Brian Chesky at Airbnb's announcement a couple of weeks ago about laying people off, and there was a lot of
Yep.
commentary around that. It was seen as quite good practice. And I just wonder, Karen, for business leaders and organizations watching this, when you have got difficult news to impart, both inside an organization and to the wider
Yep.
world, what your advice might be as a starting point for how you deal with that, and to what point one is really transparent and pitching that right, because if you get the tone of voice wrong and you're tone deaf, then it's going to be all over social media and going to shoot yourself in the foot.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, ideally, communications is, at the table for all of these things to begin with, well before any crisis or bad news, so that the executives are listening to them and understanding. And also these days, it's clearly imperative to be listening to and paying attention to employees, because they have their own voices now, as we see, and they're not afraid to use them. So um, I'm all for as much transparency as possible. And let's be clear, there are rarely times that a company can have 100% transparency, but they can be as honest and these days human as possible. So to your point, Brian's announcement, I believe another one that people praised was the CEO of Marriott Corporation, the hotel chain. He did a video, I think, that was highly praised, and he showed the pain of all the massive layoffs that they were about to do, and whatever else. But anyway, there's a couple of good examples there. So you can't write updates every day. You don't want to, and you have to do a lot more internal communication, I think, than external during these hard times. But you have to acknowledge and represent what you're doing externally in a way that's not. It can't be sort of a kind of a cynical play on, well, everyone else is doing this, we're going to kind of one up the other companies. You can't do it in that kind of spirit. It has to be, here's what we're doing for our employees, or here's why we have chosen this path, whether it's layoffs or furloughs or keeping people on and taking pay cuts and all of that is good. And also people want to know what are your uh, rules about what you're doing for people working from home or moving to a different place, or whatever all of that stuff is. You want to be in pretty constant touch internally, as I say, with your employees, and have people at the ready to answer all their questions about their particular cases, and then publicly to be able to present and explain this is what we're doing and why, and this is the state that we want to get to, and we are thanking our employees first, and we're thanking our customers such as they are, and all the rest of it. And it has to be really from the heart. It has to be genuine.
And in your experience, can that be quite a challenge when you then have to overlay into that the founder or CEO's
I mean, it can be
personality?
yes, sure, if they're not up for it, if they're not cut out for that kind of thing, maybe don't put them out. They don't all have to be on video, I would say. Some are not. I think I saw an earlier video from Brian Chesky where he was speaking specifically to the hosts, the Airbnb hosts, and that did not land well to me as a viewer. I thought he didn't make good eye contact. I didn't think his messages were that good. I don't know. They had other communications with the host, and that might have been better. But sometimes a written statement uh, can work much better than video if they're not up for it. But the main thing is they have to be listening to their communications people to make sure that the messages are, exactly right and hit the right note and have helpful follow-up information or whatever else they need. And if they can't perform well, um, don't put them on don't put them
Yeah.
on video. Have a nice picture of them at home holding a dog while you have. But honestly, it's kind of part of the job now that they have to be able to talk and communicate in some fashion, if internally, if not externally.
Mm. Yeah, I agree.
But we've all had to get better at video, honestly.
Yeah, haven't we? Yeah. Um, one area that interests me, Karen, is the relationship between our personal stories and our
Yeah,
professional lives. And
yeah,
uh, you're the author of the book "Taking the Work Out of Networking," which is very much about our career journeys. And I think how we tell our career stories is part of that. I just want to zoom in on our personal stories and you know sharing my own personal stories in my career was a real game changer for me, really stepping up professionally. And I didn't realize that until I did that. And when I was just kind of researching for this call, I dived into your old blog spots, Karen. I had an old
oh yeah,
blogger at Blogspot as well, and it was lovely reading some really old posts from you. But also, I got a flavour from you telling quite personal stories about a dog and your mother and all those kind of
yeah,
things. So,
yeah.
so what's your take on to what extent we tell very personal stories and perhaps are vulnerable and talk about things in a very honest way in a professional context?
Yeah, it is a very subjective area, but I believe, as the saying goes, that ship has sailed, that we have a bright line between personal and professional. I mean, the era of social media, however much you participate or not, has really softened that boundary for everybody. The expectation is much more now that we know something personal about people, whether it's the celebrities, we often may know too much, but CEOs too, and people want to know the origin story of people, and whatever else their lives are like, or their interests are like. So we know that Tim Cook of Apple is a big uh, fan of, I'm going to not remember the name, but the football team at the University of Alabama where he went, right? And we know that, um, I'm trying to think of another CEO of note, that we know just some personal, details about. Well, here's a different example: Pete Buttigieg, a candidate who might not have even appeared before 2019, 2020. We met his husband on social media. We saw the dog. We know about Elizabeth Warren's dog Bailey. I mean, the, this is the blending of personal and professional. I actually write about it in the book, where um, the idea of someone having just a public persona that is very, shall we say, transactional and very kept apart from the rest of one's life. I mean, those days are over. Now, we each can control how much we want to share of the personal stuff, I think. Um, but I do think it's more important, and the expectation is that more executives and more business people who have some public footprint of some sort, even just within their company, um, that there'll be a more personal side that we know, and not just them, that we all share a bit about ourselves in the workplace and now on on Zoom, uh, so that people have a fuller context to work from, a fuller understanding of who each other is and what makes them tick, and that can speak to diversity of interests and diversity of backgrounds and so on. I just think we're past the time when you can keep everything in silos. And so let's make the most of it. Again, knowing you can control, and no executive is going to, open the doors to a personal life entirely, nor should they. But uh, the idea of having more personal touches and more personal interest come into the equation, and kind of give color to business leaders and so on, is I think very important um, to count on, to be able to count on, because otherwise we don't respond well. We don't know anything about that person. But when so many executives who have come, I'm thinking of the woman who for many years led Pepsi, Indra Nui, I think is her name. She, had a very stirring story about her background, and coming from India and really making her way in the world. So that's an important, part of her story that also may influence your sense of the company, right? And that's why I think these things are important to have some sense of.
Yeah, I agree. It changes our attitude to
Yeah.
business leaders. But perhaps, and I know some of this is in the book, Karen, but for an executive who is looking to advance her career and thinking about getting visibility inside the organization or in
Yeah.
an industry or market, and perhaps naturally doesn't feel comfortable with sharing her or his story, what's your advice on, some baby steps just to take to start that process of revealing something about their real selves? Have you got any advice there?
Well, it probably would start within their team, right, or within meetings that they have, and here, sometimes it's sort of has become a kind of a punchline, but the idea of team offsites, and ways for teams to, get together outside of their standard workplace or work setting, or even process, is important, because that's where maybe you start to have a sense of people, where the idea is that they're socializing, yes, but they're also kind of revealing more of themselves. So that may be the way. It doesn't have to start with anything public, but it's more kind of a level of comfort. And by the way, sometimes those offsites can be an interesting um, kind of community affairs things. I know in my years at Google and Twitter, we did a lot of volunteer work. And they were fun days for the team, but they also had a greater purpose. We'd pack or unpack bins at a food bank, for example, or something like that. And those are ways where you get to know people a little more informally, conversationally, and that's where maybe it's a safer place to sort of reveal a little more here and there. And it doesn't have to be your whole backstory either, by the way.
Yeah. I find, I've been on Instagram for a long time, and the thing about me and Instagram is I love it. It's my perhaps my favorite platform, and my favorite thing to do, to take photographs and share them. And to
Yeah.
be honest, I the thing about Instagram, unlike Twitter, is I don't always get a sense of who else is on and who else is watching and who else is seeing. And
Right.
what I forgot in the early days, and I forgot it in a good way, was that I have all these business and professional contacts on Instagram, but they might not always engage with me. And but sometimes they would, and I'd go, ah, she's on, of course, she's seeing me. But what was nice, I was never had the constraint of thinking, oh, I better not reveal too much about myself because all these people are watching. And
No,
I
that's
think de facto, it's been a great way of me sharing, not too deeply personal stuff, but just what makes Ian tick on a day-to-day basis. I
yeah.
wonder whether sometimes that's a nice, authentic way of how we reveal ourselves, right?
Absolutely. I think I use Instagram similarly to how you do, and I don't. Uh, uh, for me, it's I like taking pictures, and I see things, and so I just post them there. And I really have done very little kind of work there, but it is a nice way for the visually inclined anyway to have an outlet there. and there are others I think that people have. I know people who have Etsy stores that I just discovered, because we're all looking for face masks on on Etsy.
Yeah.
So, but people that have different outlets, I think are great. That are part of who they are, certainly, but maybe not the main thing that we might know them for within a business context. And it does round out someone else to know that they're interested in this and that. That's something not related to work, or something they've built upon their professional interest. I met in the course of doing the book a woman who's she's an architecture and design critic, so she writes about these things, but she actually does have a professional interest on Instagram where she'll post about articles she's written, or places that she was traveling, and hope will be again. And she said, through that she would get invited to, New Zealand to come speak at an event, or she'd get commissions for other articles because she was posting something visual related to architecture design. And she was doing it not to, not as a business development thing, but it actually ended up helping her.
Mm. Well, look, people should check you out on Instagram. And I know I've been feeding back because I've been loving your daily walks in lockdown San Francisco. Some wonderful, wonderful architecture and plant life that you've been capturing on that. So everyone should check that out.
Oh, thank you.
Look, before we wrap, just finally, Karen, I'm curious to know, what kind of stories you're drawn to, when you're not working, when you're putting on Netflix or listening to podcasts, or you've got some bookshelves behind you there, perhaps delving into a book. What kind of things interest you in terms of genres, or what kind of stories you might go to?
I tend to be a nonfiction and documentary fan. There's just something to me about a thing I didn't know that really happened, right? Documentaries are great at sort of, revealing that. And so I do go to those a lot, but not exclusively. I find what I am loving is serial stories. So rather than a movie, for example, although have watched and always will watch plenty of movies, but I do like the idea of some kind of serial, even if it's 4 or 6 or 8 episodes, where it's unfolding over time, and you get to see more of the characters. And this is a golden age for serial TV, both fiction and nonfiction, I have to say. So among other things, right now I'm watching something on Netflix called Trial by Media, which is revisiting old stories that were huge in the news, and how the news coverage affected almost everything about the story, and often the trial. They often involve crime, and so but the massive amount of coverage would had an outsized effect on how things landed in terms of a legal case or something like that. So that's one example, but I could talk for a long time about all the stuff I'm watching. But I tend to like those kind of things a little better, for the most part. But on the fiction side, when a story is well told, I just believe the characters even after the show ends. It's sort of like I believe they're out in the world when they're really well done.
And it kind of feels like we are spoiled for choice, aren't we? I mean, the amount of things that get recommended to us, and with
Yes.
Netflix and podcasts and everything else. So I find, I want to choose carefully, because I don't know about you, but I struggle sometimes if I feel there's too many must-watch things. I have to make decisions and go, that might be amazing series, but that's 34 episodes, and that's a big ask, and I'm going to leave it. I know I might be missing out, but
Right.
but choose carefully. I don't know if it's available outside of the UK, but BBC has a wonderful documentary strand called Storyville, which I'll link you up to, and some of those aren't commissioned; they're not original BBC productions, but it's a window for some other independent documentaries that they showcase. And I've watched some wonderful things there. And when I in the days when we used to travel, when I used to travel for work, I'd always on the way back on a train journey or a plane would allow myself watch a documentary, and kind of being 90 minutes typically, it was a lovely format and a lovely
Yeah,
way to
yeah, yeah,
window into things that I might not otherwise know about. So I'm with you on the documentaries.
yeah.
Well, look, this has been fascinating, Karen. Thank you so much for sharing the story, lifting the lid on your career. And I thought I knew a lot about you, but I've learned a lot about you over the last 30 minutes. So thank you very much for your time.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I love talking to you, and this has been great fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Karen.